So you talked this weekend about the idea of trial and tempting out of, what was it, 1 Corinthians 10?
Yes.
So could you just tell like a brief summary of why that's interesting, the difference between the two Greek words, and how it's dishonest how the translators are using the two?
Yeah, so it's interesting that it's the same Greek word peirazo that can mean it can mean I test, I try, or I tempt. And I would say the vast majority of the time in the New Testament it should be translated as like trial or testing. Um, and so in 1 Corinthians 10, he says, most translations render it, no temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to man. Um, okay, so the Greek word peirazo can be translated I tempt or I test or try. And the vast majority of the times in the New Testament it's found it should be, in my opinion, translated I test, because it's more it fits the context better, and it fits the like the ethos of the passage better. And so in 1 Corinthians 10, where most translations render it, no temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to men, it really doesn't make sense in the context of 1 Corinthians 10, because it's all about the testing of the Israelites in the wilderness, and that runs parallel to Hebrews 3 and 4, where it talks about them being tested and tested and tried. So for instance, in Hebrews 3, he says, "Today, if you should hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day of the provocation, as in the day of testing." There's no way that would be translated temptation, right? Because it's just God was testing them, and then he kind of reinforces that by saying, "When your fathers tested me those 40 years."
Oh, okay.
Another piece of this is peirazo and dokimazo go together like two sides of the same coin in Greek. They're often found together in the New Testament, and basically it speaks of testing and being approved. So you have some think about gold. Gold is tested in the refining process, and the impurities that are in it are shown by rising to the top and being skimmed off. And so once it's being tested and there's no more impurities, then it's proved. It's dokimazoed. And so in the context of 1 Corinthians 10, where it's talking about the Israelites in the wilderness being tested for 40 years and them showing themselves to be what they were, idolaters and fornicators and grumblers and all these things in the context of 1 Corinthians 10. So then when he says, no testing or no trial has overtaken you except that which is common to men. That's where now it also helps us to make sense of what he says in the latter part of the verse where he says, "For God has built in," I'm paraphrasing, "God has built into the trial the end." So a lot of translations will render that he has made with the temptation a way of escape. But that doesn't really make sense, because God doesn't make temptation. Temptation may be part of a trial, but temptation in itself does not have intrinsic value. It doesn't have any value in itself. And so, but trial does. Trial always has redemptive value in God's plan, because that's his way of dealing with his people. That's what it means when it says, no trial has overtaken you except that which is common to men. That's how God deals with his people. And so we should expect that. But we also have to know that God has built into the trial the end of the trial. Just as for the Israelites, the trial was going through the wilderness, the end was the promised land. God built into that trial the end. And so God has built into every trial that comes into our lives an end of the trial, even if in some cases that's death. But often it's not. Often the end is some unforeseen circumstance that we can't even imagine happening, and God delivers us out of that trial. And so we need to have that in mind and have that faith, seeing the end of the trial through eyes of faith so that we can then bear the trial. Because if it feels like there's no end and we're not seeing that by faith, then how can we stand, how can we bear
Right.
the trial? And we'll always try to get out of it.
So when the Lord teaches us to pray, he says, "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name." The part of that later on that goes, "Lead us not into temptation," you would say that that's a bad translation. It should
Yes.
actually be, "Lead us not into trial."
Exactly.
So how is that different if we're praying that daily?
Yeah, that's a good question. So asking God to not lead us into trial is born of the fact that we know that like we're not like some like stupid courageous person who thinks that they can Peter was acting, Lord, even if everyone else denies you, like I won't. Right.
Yeah.
And that's just like you're set up for a fall when that's the kind of thing that comes out of your mouth. So the humble person recognizes their own inability to endure trial and says, Lord, lead us not into trial, lead us not into testing, but deliver us from evil. Knowing that God may lead us into trial according as he sees fit, but it's not something that we go looking for.
Yeah. So the guy who is being tempted to sin, okay, he usually holds on to a passage like 1 Corinthians 10 and is saying, okay, there it is. God's going to always provide a way out, right? But it sounds like it's a trial, and the way out is the end, you said? Like he's built the end
yeah.
into it. And that could be death, because God wants us to see, correct me if I'm wrong, God wants us to see this world as not heaven, right? It's maybe a better way of putting it is this world is not smooth. This world is really rough.
Yep.
So in this world you will have tribulation, right?
That's right. And the way out of temptation is very clear, like in James and other passages where he says, flee youthful lusts. Like resist the devil and he will flee from you. So when in the moment of temptation, like, yeah, I mean, you have to flee from that. Like you have to be like Joseph, when Potiphar's wife is like grabbing onto him and like trying to have sex with him, and he literally like leaves his clothes, his outer garment in her hand, and gets out of there because it's like there's no place for me, like this has nothing for me, and realizing that and running. But yeah, like you said, the end of the trial itself, maybe the trial is like a tendency toward lust, or I mean, it could be anything, but in the context of pornography, like the trial may be like, okay, I see this tendency in myself. I see this tendency for a desire for stimulation, and I'm going to, like, by the grace of God, I'm going to crucify that, and I'm going to not make any provision for the flesh, but realizing that, so I don't want to be fatalistic, because I don't want to say like, okay, I'm always going to struggle with this. Like that's not what we want to believe. Like, if somebody struggles with, I don't know, sex addiction or same-sex attraction or something, it's like you don't want to think like, okay, I'm just always going to deal with this.
Right.
Until I die. The mindset should never be fatalistic like that. It should be, God, I believe that you are a rewarder of those who diligently seek you, and that you are going to deliver me from this sinful tendency. So how does that harmonize with the idea that God appoints the trial and he builds into it the end, so that knowing that by faith we can bear the trial? I would say it's compatible, because the trial is something that we can't escape ourselves. Like it's something that we have to go through. And temptation may be a part of that, but not thinking like, okay, just because this is how it is now, it's how it's always going to be. Seeing like and believing that God has made an end to this.